And in my
Or
research,
10 years of research.
And quite a bit of
research. Scientific research points to
research at the university.
Based on the research.
This is Research in Progress, a podcast by the Research Office at the Graduate Institute.
Hello, it is my great pleasure to interview Dr. Shriya Patnaik, who just completed and defended her PhD dissertation entitled Temple Dancer, Prostitute, Celibate Nun, The Shifting Position of the Mahari Devadasi from Late Colonial India to the Early 21st Century. So Shriya, maybe to start, can you kind of break down that title? So who are the Mahari Devadasis and how did their position shift across the colonial to the post-colonial period?
Thank you so much for this, Nicole. Considering that a large chunk of my thesis sought to answer precisely this question, I'm going to give you a distilled, summarized version of it here. So, before the imposition of direct British rule in India in 1857, Devadasis inhabited and performed ritualistic services in temples. They were socially not bound to the institution of marriage, as they were ceremonially wed to Hindu temple deities in rituals akin to traditional Hindu weddings. They played a crucial role in providing performative song, dance, and devotional services within temples, typically receiving a stipend for their contributions in the form of endowments and landed estates known as inams. As the ceremonial consorts of the deity, Devadasis were prohibited from marrying mortal men. However, as the thesis shows, many engaged in sexual relationships with male patrons from upper castes or from royal families. And I show how this unique position allowed them to challenge conventional heteronormative notions of marriage and sexuality. However, I also find it worth mentioning that such privileges should not be overstated. While these women possessed a certain degree of autonomy relative to married women historically, they were reliant on a network of influential male figures within the temple's socio-political structure, including priests, kings, and patrons. These dynamics, while situating these women amidst a system of male patronage, also set their experiences apart from those of commercial sex workers, who have historically been characterized by a different set of social relations. Devadasi's relationships, on the other hand, took place within a broader cultural context of symbolic and material exchanges, placing them in a unique position that simultaneously reflected both autonomy and subservience. I also study how, on their regional heterogeneities, Devadasis form local communities known by different names in different areas, and Maharis being the regional term for the community of Devadasis in the Jagannath Temple of Puri in Odisha. These women historically received a regular maintenance allowance from temple funds and held ancestral properties in Odisha in return for their religious duties. However, as chapters 1 and 2 show, in the aftermath of laws abolishing the tradition, and its criminalization under sections 372 and 373 of the Indian Penal Code in 1929, the custom started to acquire some sort of a scandalous reputation. Across colonial and post-colonial India, regional Devadasi communities began to be viewed as immoral and aberrant on account of their alleged links with prostitution. In particular, I make 3 core claims in my thesis. Firstly, both colonial authorities and Anglo-Indian courts conflated Devadasi dedications with prostitution, despite some awareness of the distinctions between the two, towards implementing a comprehensive and consistent prostitution policy. Key factors that drove the colonial government's denunciation of Devadasis included the Contagious Diseases Acts, the provocative influence of Catherine Mayo's acerbic writings, and the human rights standards set forth by the League of Nations, which urged Imperial Britain to confront the Devadasi problem. Despite these pressures, I study how the colonial government hesitated to enact formal abolitionist legislation due to counter pressures from rising anti-colonial nationalisms and a putative commitment to a policy of religious non-interference. Secondly, it was in this context that Indian legislators took the lead in the 1920s and 1930s, introducing abolitionist bills in both the central parliament and state legislatures. Supporting these allowed the colonial state to present itself as being supportive of reform, while also creating the veneer that such changes stemmed from within the Hindu community, rather than being imposed by a foreign power. Ultimately, although the constraints of anti-colonial movements and the sensitive nature of religious issues impeded the colonial state from enacting formal legislation, I argue that the legal proceedings in colonial courts laid the groundwork for penalization measures. Thirdly, I also argue that while nationalist leaders and women reformers replicated the colonial disdain, they also deployed their own methods of reform, appropriation, and reification. In addition, I study how British and Indian women's organization, formed in the decolonizing decades, proved to be the missing link in cementing the gaps in official efforts through their advocacy campaigns and on-ground level work. For Indian women leaders in particular, my thesis underscores how an avowed emphasis on the normalization of the heterosexual patriarchal family structure, along with their denigration of non-domesticated women like Devadasis, courtesans, concubines, and sex workers, who were all homogenized through a uniform optic, served their dual agenda of producing a respectable female citizen subject, as well as conforming to the gender demands of the nationalist project. And finally, I elucidate how, with the extinction of the Mahari community in 2021, we again start to notice perceptible shifts in regional popular culture and social memory, with the invocation of Maharis as quote-unquote celibate nuns or Vestal virgins in Odisha. In the aftermath of the community's demise, together with the rise of right-wing politics in the present, I thus trace the emergence of a nostalgia-filled, romanticized regional discourse in the present in its characterization of Maharis as desexualized figures. Therefore, my thesis substantiates, through all these factors, that writing a revivalist history of this community is not a static process, but rather a dynamic one, which is also based on the socio-political realities of the time.
Thanks, Shriya. I think that really captures the richness of the, so many different perspectives that you're bringing into the dissertation. I wanted to dive a bit more into the question of women's rights activists and international humanitarians. So you mentioned them a little bit. Can you tell us more about the position and the role that they played in this story?
Thank you, Nicole. I think that's a particularly fascinating question, as in my research, I not only observed certain limits in the approaches of women's rights activists in international humanitarian and development organizations historically, but I also noticed certain shifts in their approaches over time that I sought to study. Firstly, perhaps, one of the things that intrigued me the most was the role of British and Indian women reformers in their unequivocal vilification of Devadasis. We've seen in the thesis, in the case of British feminists like Josephine Butler, Millicent Shepherd, and Alison Nealance, how, although they acknowledged that dedications posed a fundamental barrier to their abolitionist work, they were unable to operationalize their ideological agendas into targeted interventions in British India. We've also witnessed in the thesis how, although emancipatory in their calls for Indian women's suffrage, education, and property rights, the work of British feminists ultimately succumbed to racialized and orientalized imaginations of colonized women needing the civilizing guardianship of the colonial state. And I think this is an aspect that distanced the British feminist movement from its Indian counterparts. Coming to the question of Indian women reformers and their limits. With respect to the work of Indian women leaders in the 1900s, I must say that I myself encountered certain changes in my own outlook to them and their work. When I first embarked on this project, I had a largely positivist outlook of Indian women leaders and their work. Mainly as a byproduct of my early education in India, I was introduced to increasingly idealized histories of notable Indian women leaders in my early years, such as we see in the thesis like Muthulakshmi Reddy, Sarojini Naidu, Durgabai Deshmukh, Sarla Devi, and their stalwarts. My initial understanding of these figures was largely positive, framed within a nationalist context. However, as this project progressed and I learned more about their ideational positions and the organizations they led, like the All India Women's Conference, National Council for Women in India, or Women's Indian Association, I began to notice key limitations to their work. I came to recognize that their emancipatory agendas, in some instances, did not effectively empower their intended target groups, particularly undomesticated communities of women such as Devadasis. For example, in the thesis, we see how one of the most vocal advocates for Devadasi abolition, an influential Indian woman activist by the name of Dr. Muthulakshmi Reddy, recommended integrating these women as quote-unquote chaste housewives or deferential maidservants. Recommendations such as those by other Indian leaders like compulsory marriages, forceful rehabilitation in governmental shelters, some even venturing so far in recommending asylums for Devadasis. Rehabilitation, with consent deemed irrelevant, disclosed to me that their efforts did not always serve the best interests of their target beneficiaries. While I do agree that some reform efforts may have been well-intentioned, they reflect what Gayatri Spivak calls, quote-unquote, a well-intentioned epistemic violence, liberatory projects that ultimately deny subaltern women the right to define the terms of their own existence. Thus, as this work progressed, I started to look at all sets of actors more critically in their approaches to Devadasis. Let us also look at the international human rights arena's approaches to Devadasis. In the thesis' penultimate chapter, we see how the ILO's Committee of Experts on the Application of Conventions and Recommendations issued a series of guidelines on Devadasis to the Indian government from 2008 to 2016. What I found is that, paradoxically enough, in spite of its goal of promoting human rights, we note the ILO Committee adopt a disciplinary paradigm in recommending that the government take stricter legal action against parties engaged in dedication and also calling for greater police intervention. However, the committee then also notes that law enforcement agencies cannot single-handedly achieve results, and that Indian self-help groups and grassroots NGOs play a greater role with an enhancement of local-level NGO capacity building. This also made me explore certain Devadasi NGOs and also sex worker right NGOs that worked in a similar vein towards ensuring rights for these groups. In this chapter, we thus also see Indian NGOs such as the Sampark NGO in Karnataka working together with the ILO in 2015 to implement targeted interventions. In this aspect, one development that surprised me was the role of ex-Devadasis as stakeholders in contemporary development projects. Many such NGOs in present-day India have integrated former Devadasis as social workers in their projects, aiming to devise holistic healthcare, educational and legal safeguards for women and their children. However, I discovered that this comes with an important caveat, and that is, for Devadasis to be the beneficiaries of such projects, they must relinquish their practices of religiosity and become modern, aka irreligious. And that ties into another one of my arguments. The quotidian cultures of Devadasis starkly contrast with the contemporary realities faced by sex workers in modern India, whose sexual labor is framed within a secular framework of rights. At the beginning of the 21st century, sex workers in India, for example, have proved to be remarkably successful in organizing in civil society and calling for the decriminalization of sex work. Their efforts have been met with results in the form of the 2022 Indian Supreme Court judgment, which is a landmark judgment because after decades of historical injustices against sex work, this judgment recognizes sex work as a legitimate form of labor. The Supreme Court also issues directives to protect sex workers from police harassment. In contrast, while Devadasis have made modest strides in mobilizing for change and forming grassroots collectives, a call for legislation like in the sex worker context would be unimaginable. I thus argue that Devadasi's religious selves emerge as an antique souvenir in the confines of the modern secular nation state, with either alternatives of abandoning their erstwhile selves or risking being seen as disrespectable citizen subjects.
I mean, so beyond in the thesis, obviously you tell us how many other actors viewed the Maharis, but you're also actually able to give us some sense of how the Maharis themselves viewed their own situation, right? You found some really interesting sources in the archives, petitions from Mahari Devadasis commenting on these reform movements. You talked to actually the last two Mahari Devadasis before they passed away, did these interviews, you looked at some temple iconography, you analyzed some of the songs that they sang, and all of that really allows us to see this story from the perspective of Maharis. So what do you think that changes in the narrative, right, if we actually look at the Maharis themselves and their perspectives?
I would say my use of sources and methods is indeed one of the things that sets this research apart from previous studies on Devadasis or Maharis. And I'm going to dive into a bit of a personal, anecdotal narrative of my own sort of story in accessing the records and sources and what they told and what they did not. While I started my PhD in 2019, the scope of my research was radically different, as back then I predominantly wanted to focus on legal and policy mediations that constituted the marginalization of Mahari Devadasis, and then juxtapose this with insider testimonies. As I progressed with my data collection and fieldwork over the years, I came to realize that an analysis of this community could not be so straightforward and one-dimensional, merely in binaristically contrasting top-down state interventions with bottom-up Devadasi experiential accounts. Instead, the history surrounding this community was complex and multifaceted in nature, and it required multiple domains of inquiry, spanning legal and policy developments in colonial and postcolonial India, insider accounts, particularly from the last two Maharis I interviewed, Sashimani and Parasamani, the performative stages of the classical dances accompanied by an upper caste appropriation of the cultural capital of these women, international human rights parameters, NGO work, and the community's religious positioning. In analyzing such sources, I came to realize that studied together, these changed the narrative in certain critical ways. In all of the archival records that I reviewed across 11 archives in Odisha, New Delhi, London, Geneva, and Heidelberg, I found multiple positions held by colonial, national, developmental, international humanitarian, feminist, and dance actors. But nowhere, and I actually mean that literally nowhere, in all of these diverse positions did I find their invocation of the single voice of a Devadasi herself. Instead, all of their views were either grounded in generalizations, abstractions, or non-insider accounts. Somewhat disturbed by an acute dearth of any accounts in the actual word of a Devadasi herself, my search in the archives became somewhat one-directional. As I was exposed to an overwhelming abundance of non-Devadasi narratives in sources such as these, I became determined to explore and write about the other side of the story. It was only after more than a year of archival searching that I finally found this eureka moment in the form of the two Devadasi petitions in this thesis. In invoking these petitions as key historical sources, I have sought to emphasize how they destabilized the dominant narrative, as well as what they embodied and signified. I thereby argue that petitioning gave rise to a judicialization of politics, whereby colonized subjects turned to petitioning as an alternative to legal redress in instances where they failed in courts or could not afford legal fees. The colonial state accommodated them as reading petitions allowed officials to engage in the fantasy of acting as saviors to their colonized populations. Especially in the case of women-authored petitions such as the two we see in the thesis, these pleas intensified imperial fantasies, tapping into what Gayatri Spivak has described as white men's imaginary that they were rescuing brown women from brown men. So the petitions became especially important for me to study and analyze. Furthermore, including imagery of temple iconography, Odissi dance videos from the Sangeet Natak Academy archives, and Mahari testimonies helped me articulate certain regional specificities in the context of Odisha. First, they enabled me to see the Devadasis as an intrinsic part of Odisha's temple history, with their sexuality not viewed adversely, but rather intertwined with divine religious worship in the Sakta and Maithuna denominations of Hinduism regionally. Second, they helped me also see how dancers' treatment of Maharis has changed over the years. In newly independent India, early classical dance maestros initially omitted Maharis from Odissi's emergent repertoire, whereas we now see contemporary dancers now invoke Maharis in increasingly romanticized terms following the community's extinction. Thirdly, I found that Mahari oral testimonies allowed me to examine how iterations of subversion and adaptation were not just articulated through overt acts of resistance. They also manifested in other subtle markers, such as performances, articulations of songs and poetic compositions, recollections of memory, and everyday conversations. Finally, these sources make the thesis a multi-sited and multi-scalar historical ethnography, not just in terms of this research being dispersed across multiple sites of analysis. In collating a diverse range of perspectives from a multiplicity of terrains such as these, I have also sought to shed light on the many iterations of Mahari identity across time and space, and also study the manifold meanings that these distinct yet interrelated vistas of investigation can reveal about Devadasis across India and more specifically Maharis in Odisha. Thank you.
Thanks, Shriya. Super interesting to hear about it again, although I've read it, but lovely to hear you kind of summarize it here. Thanks, Shriya.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you, Mark.